Hello and welcome to another session where we explore the most critical aspects of history and human nature.
Today, we are turning our attention to a figure who is, I think it's fair to say, the most scrutinized in American history.
Abraham Lincoln. We have a massive stack of source material here, historical records, biographical details, and a lot of political analyses.
And our goal is to perform a really comprehensive biographical analysis of the 16th President of the United States.
It's a subject that, it just demands a serious and strictly factual approach.
Absolutely. We're looking at the timeline from his birth, 1809, all the way through his assassination in 1865.
And then, of course, that complex legacy he left behind.
It's so easy to look at the marble statue and just forget the man.
Right. We tend to mythologize him. But the sources we have paint a picture of someone far more complex, far more human.
We're talking about a man who rose from incredibly humble beginnings. I mean, a log cabin with a dirt floor.
And from there, he had to navigate the most treacherous political landscape this country has ever seen.
Precisely. And to understand how he did that, we have to strip away the myth and really look at the contradictions in his character.
What do you mean by contradictions?
Well, the historical record shows us a man who was prone to debilitating depression, a deep, deep melancholy.
Yet he had this iron will.
An iron will. And he was a political moderate who, in the end, presided over the most radical transformation of the nation's economy and its social structure.
So our mission today is to extract the most significant insights from these records. We want to cover the details that the average person might not know, move beyond the penny and the $5 bill.
Let's start at the very beginning, his frontier origins.
We begin in Kentucky.
Right. February 12, 1809. He was born in a one-room log cabin on a place called Sinking Spring Farm.
And this wasn't just humble, this was real poverty.
It was. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a carpenter and a farmer. The records trace his lineage back to Samuel Lincoln, who came over from England in 1638. But by the time we get to Thomas, well, the situation is unstable.
And that instability seems to be a recurring theme, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The sources mention that Thomas Lincoln kept losing land.
He did. And it wasn't that he was a bad farmer. The problem was that the legal titles in Kentucky were a complete mess.
So he would buy a farm, work it, and then someone else would show up with a better claim.
Essentially, yes. Property laws were chaotic. Thomas lost hundreds of acres because of these title disputes. He just couldn't secure clear ownership.
And this legal insecurity is actually what drove them out of the state.
It did. They moved to Indiana in 1816. The land titles there were more reliable because they came directly from the federal government. A much safer bet.
So young Abraham is growing up watching his father struggle with the legal system. But then a much deeper tragedy strikes the family.
A devastating one. When Abraham was only 9 years old, his mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, passed away.
From something called milk sickness.
Yes, in 1818, it was caused by drinking milk from cows that had eaten the white snake root plant. It was a terrible way to die.
And that just left the household in chaos, I imagine.
It did. The care of the home fell to Lincoln's older sister, Sarah, who was only 11 herself.
An impossible burden for a child. But the family dynamic shifted again a year later.
Thomas Lincoln remarried, and this seems to be a really pivotal moment in Abraham's emotional life. A woman named Sarah Bush Johnston enters the picture.
His stepmother.
She was a widow, and she had 3 children of her own. And by all accounts in the historical record, the bond between Abraham and his stepmother was just profound.
He called her Mama.
He did. She brought a sense of order, affection, and stability back into the home. And it's really interesting to contrast his relationship with her to the one he had with his father.
Right. The sources all suggest a significant distance between Abraham and Thomas Lincoln.
A very strained relationship. As Abraham grew up, he just became more and more distant from his father.
Why is that?
Thomas was a man of manual labor. He didn't see much value in books or the intellectual pursuits that Abraham was so drawn to.
There was a fundamental disconnect.
And it lasted his whole life. Later on, the record shows Lincoln refused to attend his father's deathbed or even his funeral in 1851.
That's a telling detail. It speaks volumes.
It really does.
And speaking of those intellectual pursuits, let's talk about his education. We always hear he was self-taught, but what did that actually look like on the frontier?
Well, his formal schooling was incredibly sporadic. He attended what were called blab schools.
Blab schools?
Subscription schools where students learned by reciting their lessons out loud all at the same time. You can imagine the noise.
So not exactly a focused learning environment.
Not at all. And if you total up all the days he ever attended any school in Kentucky and Indiana, it amounts to less than 12 months.
Less than a year. a formal education, yet he became one of the great writers in the English language.
Because he had a voracious appetite for reading. He read everything he could get his hands on, the Bible, Shakespeare, histories.
And this was despite his father's disapproval.
Yes. Thomas often needed him for manual labor on the farm. In those days, it was customary for fathers to hire out their sons and pocket the wages. Abraham did this until he was 21. All the money went to his father.
There's also this other side to him that we don't often think about, his physical side. We picture the tall, lanky lawyer, but in his youth, he was known for being incredibly strong.
He was 6 feet 4 inches tall, which was exceptionally tall for that era, and he was powerful. He gained a reputation as a skilled wrestler.
There's that famous match in New Salem, right?
Against the leader of a local gang called the Clary's Grove Boys. He held his own, and it earned him a certain level of respect in that rough frontier society. He wasn't just a bookworm.
But before we get to New Salem, there's one more event from his youth that seems to have really shaped his worldview.
The flatboat trip.
Down the Mississippi.
Right. As a young man, he helped take a flatboat of goods down to New Orleans. This was his first real exposure to the wider world.
And specifically, to the slave markets of the Deep South.
Exactly. The historian Michael Burlingame notes that this experience left an indelible impression on Lincoln. He was repelled, just disgusted by what he saw.
So it grounds his later political positions in a very real, very visceral personal experience.
It absolutely does.
Moving forward then, in 1830, the family moves again, this time to Illinois. Abraham is 21, and he decides to strike out on his own.
He lands in a small village called New Salem. And this period seems to be defined by a series of, well, failures and struggles. He's trying to find his footing.
He tries his hand at business. The general store.
The Lincoln Berry store. The partnership was a disaster.
What went wrong?
The sources are pretty clear that his partner, William Berry, was an alcoholic. The business just fell apart, and it left Lincoln with a significant debt.
I've heard this referred to as his national debt.
It took him years to pay it all off. And to make ends meet while he was doing that, he took on odd jobs. He was a postmaster, a county surveyor.
But crucially, this is when he begins to seriously study law.
And again, this wasn't through a formal school. There were no law schools out there.
So how did he do it?
He borrowed legal texts, specifically Blackstone's commentaries, from an attorney he knew, John Todd Stewart. He just read them on his own. He later stated, very simply, that he studied with nobody.
It's just an incredible display of self-discipline.
It is. And he passed the bar. He was admitted to the Illinois bar in 1836.
So he becomes a lawyer and moves to Springfield. He starts riding the circuit. For those who might not know, what did that actually entail?
It was a grueling life. It meant traveling from county seat to county seat with the judge and all the other lawyers to hear cases.
Because the smaller towns didn't have permanent courts.
Exactly. So the court came to them. And Lincoln handled every type of case you can imagine. Disputes over livestock, river barge conflicts, murder trials.
But it was more than just a job, wasn't it? It was how he built his network.
It was. It allowed him to meet thousands of people, to understand the mind of the average voter. It was his real political education.
There are a couple of legal cases from this period that really stand out in the records. One involves a bridge and a boat.
Right. Heard v. Rock Island Bridge Company. This was a landmark case. A river boat had crashed into a railroad bridge, and the boat owners sued. They argued the bridge was a hazard to navigation.
So it was old technology versus new technology.
Precisely. The river economy versus the coming railroad economy. Lincoln defended the railroad. He argued that the right to cross a river was just as important as the right to travel up and down it.
He was positioning himself on the side of modernization. He won, right?
Yeah, he did. It was a huge victory for the railroads.
And the other famous case, the Almanac trial. This one sounds like something out of a movie.
It really does. It was the murder trial of William Duff Armstrong. The key witness for the prosecution claimed he saw Armstrong commit the crime by the light of a full moon.
A very specific detail.
Too specific, it turned out. Lincoln produced a farmer's almanac for that year, and he used a judicial notice to show that at the time of the murder, the moon was at a very low angle. It would have been nearly dark.
So he completely discredited the eyewitness.
He did. And Armstrong was acquitted. It just shows the sharp, practical intelligence he had.
But while he's building this career, his internal state is, well, it's not great. The sources talk a lot about his melancholy.
Which today, clinicians would almost certainly diagnose as clinical depression. It was a recurring, debilitating condition throughout his life.
And there was a major trigger for one of his worst episodes early on.
The death of Anne Rutledge in 1835. Now, the exact nature of their romance is debated among historians. Some dispute how serious it was.
But his reaction wasn't in dispute.
No. He took her death incredibly hard. There are reports from friends that they were worried he was suicidal. They had to watch him closely.
And the treatment for this melancholy at the time was almost as dangerous as the condition itself.
He was prescribed something called blue mass pills. These pills contain mercury.
Mercury?
The idea was to treat the liver, which some doctors thought regulated mood. We know now, of course, that mercury is a neurotoxin. There's real speculation that mercury poisoning may have exacerbated his mood swings or affected his overall health.
It's just a reminder of how brutal medicine was back then. Let's transition to his domestic life. He's in Springfield, he's a rising lawyer, and he meets Mary Todd.
And this is a match that, on paper, looks like a collision of two completely different worlds.
She came from a very different background.
Very different. Mary Todd was from a wealthy, slave-holding family in Lexington, Kentucky. She was well-educated, ambitious, politically astute.
And Lincoln was.
As we've established, from a background of poverty and manual labor, their courtship was rocky.
They broke off the engagement at one point.
They did in 1841. It was a very difficult period for both of them, but they reconciled and finally married in November of 1842.
The marriage itself is often described as difficult. What do the records actually say?
The word turbulent appears frequently. There are historical accounts from credible sources that indicate Mary could be verbally abusive and, at times, physically violent. She had a terrible temper.
But they were also committed to one another.
They were, and they were especially committed to his political ambition. They had 4 sons together: Robert, Eddie, Willie, and Tad.
And the tragedy that followed Lincoln from his own childhood, it just continued with his own children.
It's heartbreaking. Only Robert, the eldest, lived to adulthood. Eddie died in 1850, probably of tuberculosis. He was not yet 4.
And then Willie.
Willie died in the White House in 1862 at age 11. And Tad died a few years after the war at 18.
So he buried 3 of his 4 sons.
He did. And it's perhaps because of these losses that Lincoln was noted as being an incredibly permissive father. He was not strict at all. The death of Eddie and later Willie just plunged both him and Mary into the deepest grief.
Let's move into the political arena. He starts his career as a Whig. What defined his early political beliefs?
As a Whig in the Illinois legislature, and later for one term in Congress, he was a disciple of Henry Clay. He supported the American system.
Which means?
It means he was pro-business, pro-development. He supported government funding for infrastructure canals, railroads, and protective tariffs to help domestic industries. He was focused on economic modernization.
And he was instrumental in moving the state capital to Springfield.
He was. It was one of his early political victories.
So he goes to Washington as a congressman in 1847. He only serves 1 term. And there's a specific controversy that seems to have derailed him, at least temporarily.
It has to do with the Mexican-American War. Lincoln opposed the war. President Polk had justified it by claiming American blood had been shed on American soil.
And Lincoln challenged him on that.
He did. He introduced what came to be known as the spot resolutions, demanding that Polk identify the exact spot where this alleged attack occurred. He believed the administration had provoked the war just to grab territory from Mexico.
This backfired on him, didn't it?
Badly. His constituents back in Illinois were largely supportive of the war. He was derisively nicknamed Spotty Lincoln. He lost his popularity.
So he steps away from politics.
He realized he wouldn't be reelected, so he returned to Springfield and his law practice. For several years, he was essentially out of the political game.
So what brought him back? What was the catalyst?
The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854.
Championed by his great rival, Stephen A. Douglas.
A senator from Illinois, yes. This piece of legislation just blew up the political landscape. It overturned the Missouri Compromise of 1820.
And it allowed for popular sovereignty in the new territories.
Meaning the settlers there could vote on whether to allow slavery. In theory, this opened the door for slavery to expand into the northern territories where it had been banned for decades.
And for Lincoln, this was a line in the sand.
It was a profound betrayal of the Founding Fathers' intent as he saw it. He believed they had intended to put slavery on a course of ultimate extinction. This act did the opposite.
And this is what pushes him out of the dying Whig Party.
And into the newly forming Republican Party, which was founded on the principle of stopping the expansion of slavery.
This sets the stage for the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858. They're both running for the Senate seat from Illinois.
There were 7 debates in total across the state. They were a massive spectacle, drawing thousands of people.
And the format was grueling.
Hours of speaking. Douglas would speak for an hour, Lincoln for an hour and a half, then Douglas for a final half-hour rebuttal.
What were their core arguments?
Douglas argued for process for popular sovereignty. He said democracy meant local communities should decide for themselves without interference.
A legalistic argument.
Very much so. Lincoln, on the other hand, made a moral argument. He argued that slavery was a moral, social, and political wrong, and that the nation could not exist permanently half slave and half free.
Which is the core of his House Divided speech.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. He wasn't necessarily predicting civil war, but he was saying the status quo was unsustainable. The Union would eventually become all one thing or all the other.
And in the end, Lincoln actually lost that Senate election.
He did. The state legislature chose Douglas. But in losing, he won something much bigger.
A national profile.
Exactly. The transcripts of the debates were published in newspapers across the country. He established himself as the leading intellectual opponent of slavery's expansion.
And that set him up for the 1860 presidential election.
It did. But first, he had to prove to the powerful Eastern establishment that he wasn't just some frontier rube.
Which brings us to the Cooper Union speech in New York.
February 1860. This was his introduction to the country's intellectual and financial elite, and he delivered a masterclass.
What did he argue?
It was a deep historical analysis. He argued that a majority of the men who signed the Constitution had, at some point, voted to restrict slavery's expansion. He used history to validate the core plank of the Republican platform.
So he showed them he was a serious constitutional thinker.
Not just a rail splitter from Illinois, it was a triumph. And it was crucial in helping him secure the Republican nomination over better-known candidates like William Seward.
And then comes the election of 1860, a chaotic race.
A four-way race. The Democratic Party split into northern and southern factions. Lincoln won, but with only 39.8% of the popular vote.
And crucially,
he received 0 electoral votes from the South. His victory was entirely regional. The South saw him as a purely sectional president who had been elected without their consent.
And that result was the final trigger for secession.
Immediate secession. South Carolina left the Union in December of 1860. 6 other states followed before Lincoln even took the oath of office.
So the country has already fallen apart during the transition period, and it was a dangerous time for him personally.
Very dangerous. We have reports of assassination plots before he even arrived in Washington.
The Baltimore plot.
Security advisors were convinced there was a plan to kill him as he passed through Baltimore on his way to the Capitol.
So he had to travel in disguise.
He did. He wore a soft felt hat instead of his usual stovepipe, hunched over to hide his height, and snuck into Washington in the middle of the night.
And the opposition press just savaged him for it.
They called him a coward, but the threat was almost certainly real.
So he takes office, and in his first inaugural address, he tries to walk this impossibly fine line.
He does. He appeals to the mystic chords of memory. He promises he will not interfere with slavery where it already exists. He's trying to keep the border states, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, from seceding.
But at the same time,
he states clearly that the Union is perpetual and that secession is illegal. He's trying to be both conciliatory and firm.
Then comes the first real crisis. Fort Sumter, a federal fort in Charleston Harbor.
The fort is running out of food. Lincoln has a dilemma. If he sends troops to resupply it, he looks like the aggressor. If he surrenders the fort, he looks weak and legitimizes the Confederacy.
So what does he do?
He chooses a brilliant middle path. He notifies the governor of South Carolina that he is sending a ship with only provisions, food not arms or reinforcements.
Which puts the burden of starting the war on them.
Exactly. If the Confederates fire on an unarmed bread boat, they are the aggressors. Which is precisely what happened. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. The Civil War began.
And once the war starts, Lincoln immediately begins assuming war powers that were completely unprecedented.
This is where the dictator label gets thrown around by his critics. He suspends the writ of habeas corpus,
the right to a trial before being imprisoned.
He does this to secure the rail lines between Washington and the North, which ran through secessionist-sympathizing Maryland. He has officials and so-called Copperheads, anti-war Democrats, arrested and held without trial.
And the Supreme Court pushed back on this.
Chief Justice Roger Taney, in the case Ex parte Merryman, ruled that only Congress could suspend habeas corpus. He said Lincoln's actions were unconstitutional.
And Lincoln's response?
He essentially ignored the ruling. His argument was that he had to break one law, the law regarding habeas corpus, in order to save the country from being destroyed. Are all the laws but one to go unexecuted, he asked, and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated?
It's a profound constitutional question. Let's look at his cabinet. He famously did not surround himself with yes men.
No, he built what Doris Kearns Goodwin famously called a team of rivals.
He appointed the very men he had defeated for the nomination.
Seward as Secretary of State, Salmon Chase as Treasury Secretary, Edward Bates as Attorney General. He wanted the strongest and most ambitious men in the party inside his administration where he could manage them.
And he also appointed Edwin Stanton as Secretary of War.
A crucial appointment. Stanton had initially despised Lincoln. He'd called him the original guerrilla, but they eventually formed a deeply effective and close partnership in running the war effort.
The war itself was going very badly for the Union at the beginning. Lincoln had serious trouble with his generals.
The primary source of his frustration was General George B. McClellan.
Little Mac.
He was a brilliant organizer. He built the Army of the Potomac into a magnificent fighting machine, but he wouldn't use it. He had a case of the slows, as Lincoln put it. He was pathologically reluctant to commit his troops to battle.
And he was personally disrespectful to the president.
Incredibly so. He would ignore him, snub him. It was a constant struggle. Lincoln eventually had to dismiss him. Twice.
And he cycled through a string of other commanders in the East Pope, Burnside, Hooker, with disastrous results.
It wasn't until he found Ulysses S. Grant that he found the general he needed.
What was different about Grant?
Grant was not afraid to engage the enemy. After the incredibly bloody Battle of Shiloh, there were calls from all over the North to remove Grant because of the high casualties.
And Lincoln's response is famous.
I can't spare this man. He fights.
While all this fighting is happening, Lincoln's own stance on the central issue of the war slavery is evolving. It wasn't a straight line to the Emancipation Proclamation.
It wasn't. It was a very careful political calculation. Early in the war, General Fremont in Missouri tried to issue his own emancipation order. Lincoln immediately revoked it. The border states. He was terrified of losing Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri. He famously said that he hoped to have God on his side, but he had to have Kentucky. If those states seceded, the Union's strategic position would be impossible.
This context is so important for understanding his famous 1862 letter to the newspaper editor Horace Greeley.
Greeley was pushing hard for immediate emancipation, and Lincoln replied with that famous line, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it."
He frames the war's primary objective as saving the Union.
Right. It was a political statement designed to keep the broad coalition of support for the war together. But here's the crucial part. At the very moment he wrote that letter, he already had the draft of the Emancipation Proclamation hidden in his desk.
He was just waiting for the right moment.
He was waiting for a military victory so he could issue it from a position of strength, not desperation.
And that victory, such as it was Antietam in September 1862.
The bloodiest single day in American history. It was more of a bloody stalemate, but Lee's army was forced to retreat from Maryland. It was enough of a win for Lincoln.
So he issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation,
which warned that on January 1st, 1863, all slaves in areas that were still in rebellion against the United States would be thenceforward, and forever free.
He didn't free the slaves in the border states.
No, because he constitutionally couldn't. He issued it as a war measure under his power as commander-in-chief to seize enemy property. Slaves were considered property.
But its effect was revolutionary. It changed the entire purpose of the war.
It did. It transformed the war from a conflict to preserve the Union into a war to end slavery.
And it had a major diplomatic impact.
It made it politically impossible for Britain or France, who had abolished slavery themselves, to intervene on the side of the Confederacy. It also, crucially, authorized the recruitment of black soldiers into the Union Army.
Then, in November of 1863, after another great battle, we get the Gettysburg Address.
It's so short, just a few minutes long, but it completely redefined the nation.
How so?
He reached back past the Constitution to the Declaration of Independence. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
So he's connecting the war to that founding principle of equality.
Exactly. He argued that the Civil War was a test of whether a democracy, any democracy, could survive. He redefined the United States not just as a political union, but as a single nation dedicated to a moral proposition.
While the war is raging, the government is also incredibly active on the home front. There's a massive economic transformation happening.
With the Southern Democrats gone from Congress, the Republicans were able to pass their entire modernization agenda.
How do they fund the war?
They instituted the first federal income tax with the Revenue Act of 1861, and they started printing paper money, greenbacks, that wasn't backed by gold or silver.
And what about all that infrastructure he'd always supported?
They passed the Pacific Railway Acts, which launched the Transcontinental Railroad. They passed the Homestead Act, granting 160 acres of western land to settlers,
And the Land Grant Colleges Act.
creating the public university system. This legislative output, in the middle of a massive war, laid the foundation for the modern American industrial state.
But there's a darker side to the administration's policy in the West, specifically regarding Native Americans. We need to talk about the Dakota War of 1862.
It's a tragic and often overlooked chapter. In Minnesota, the Dakota people were starving. The federal government had violated treaties, and annuity payments were late and stolen by corrupt agents.
Man, they rose up.
They did. After the uprising was brutally suppressed, a military tribunal held hasty trials and sentenced 303 Dakota warriors to death.
What was Lincoln's involvement in this?
The execution lists were sent to him for his personal review. In the middle of the Civil War, he and his aides went through the trial records one by one.
And he intervened.
He did. He commuted the sentences of 264 of the men. He argued that they were combatants in a war, not common criminals. He famously said, "I could not afford to hang men for votes."
But he didn't commute all the sentences.
No, he approved the execution of 38 men whom he believed were guilty of rape or murdering civilians. They were hanged in Mankato, Minnesota. It remains the largest mass execution in U.S. history.
That's a really stark illustration of the pressures he was under and the limits of his authority, or perhaps his focus.
It is.
Moving to 1864. The war has dragged on for 3 years. The casualties are horrific. Grant is locked in a bloody stalemate with Lee in Virginia. And Lincoln has to run for re-election.
And it was not a guarantee he would win. Far from it.
In the summer of 1864, he thought he was going to lose.
He absolutely did. He was running against his former general, George McClellan, who was running on a peace platform, which essentially meant ending the war and letting the Confederacy go.
And Lincoln was so convinced he would lose that he wrote a private memo.
The blind memorandum. He had his cabinet sign the outside of a folded piece of paper without seeing what was written inside. It was a pledge to cooperate with the winner of the election to save the Union before the inauguration. He believed McClellan would not try to save it after taking office.
So what turned the tide for him?
A military victory. General William Tecumseh Sherman captured Atlanta in September. That victory changed public sentiment overnight. It convinced the North that the war could finally be won.
And he won the election handily.
He did, running on a National Union Party ticket with the war Democrat Andrew Johnson as his running mate to broaden his appeal.
The war finally ends in April 1865. Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox. But just before that, in March, Lincoln delivers his second inaugural address.
Which is one of the greatest speeches ever delivered. It's a remarkable theological and political document. Instead of triumphalism, he offers humility.
With malice toward none, with charity for all.
He suggests that the war was God's judgment on the entire nation, North and South, for the sin of slavery. He calls for reconciliation, not revenge.
The war ends on April 9th. 2 days later, on April 11th, Lincoln gives his last public speech. And he touches on the future, on Reconstruction, and on the status of Black Americans.
He does. He suggests, for the first time publicly, that the right to vote should be conferred on some Black men, specifically the very intelligent, and on those who serve our cause as soldiers.
And in the crowd that night was John Wilkes Booth.
A well-known actor and a fanatical Confederate sympathizer. Upon hearing Lincoln mention black suffrage, Booth reportedly turned to a companion and said, "That is the last speech he will ever make."
Just 3 days later, April 14th, 1865, Lincoln goes to Ford's Theater.
He and Mary were seeing a comedy, Our American Cousin. General Grant and his wife were supposed to be with them, but they declined the invitation and went to New Jersey instead.
Booth's original plan was to kidnap Lincoln.
It was, but it shifted to assassination. He entered the presidential box, which was left unguarded, around 10:01 p.m. and shot the president in the back of the head with a Derringer pistol,
He stabbed Major Rathbone, who was also in the box, and then leaped to the stage.
breaking his leg in the process. He shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants," and escaped out the back of the theater.
But Lincoln didn't die immediately.
No. A doctor in the audience rushed to him. He was carried across the street to a boarding house, the Peterson House. He remained in a coma throughout the night.
And he died the next morning.
At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Secretary of War Stanton was at his bedside and famously said, "Now he belongs to the ages."
Let's spend our remaining time on his legacy and the questions that still surround him. He had a vision for Reconstruction. What was it?
His approach was lenient. "Let him up easy," he said. He wanted a rapid reintegration of the southern states back into the Union.
10% plan.
Right, where a state could be readmitted if just 10% of its 1860 voters took an oath of allegiance to the U.S. This put him at odds with the radical Republicans in his own party, who wanted a much harsher, more fundamental restructuring of Southern society.
But he did see one fundamental change through to the end, the 13th Amendment.
Yes, and that was a massive political fight. The Emancipation Proclamation was a war measure. It could have been struck down by the courts after the war was over. The 13th Amendment permanently abolished slavery in the Constitution itself.
And he used all his political skill to get it passed.
He twisted arms, made deals. He used all of his political capital to ensure it passed the House in January 1865, just months before his death.
His reputation has shifted over the years. For a long time, he was simply the great emancipator. But that view has been challenged.
It has. In the late 1960s, scholars like Lerone Bennett Jr. argued that Lincoln was, at his core, a white supremacist who used ethnic slurs in private and consistently supported colonization.
The idea of sending freed slaves to Africa or the Caribbean.
Exactly. And it's true, Lincoln did hold views on social equality that were typical of a white man of his time. He did support colonization for much of his career.
So how do other historians respond to that critique?
They argue that we have to contextualize his rhetoric as political necessity in a deeply racist country. They point to his clear moral evolution and argue that his actions, regardless of his personal feelings, moved the nation steadily and relentlessly toward abolition, a destination that was incredibly radical for the era. His growth was immense.
And what about his religious views? He was never an Orthodox Christian.
No, he was known as a skeptic, even an unbeliever, as a young man. He never joined a church. However, the sources show a deepening reliance on a concept he called divine providence as the war went on.
Especially after the deaths of his sons, Eddie and Willie.
Yes. The immense personal loss and the staggering national loss seemed to push him toward a kind of fatalism. He came to see the war as an event controlled by a higher power, with its own divine purposes that humans couldn't fully grasp.
Finally, there are the medical theories. We talked about the Depression, but there are also theories about his unique physical structure.
He was, as we said, unusually tall, with very long limbs, fingers, and toes. Some modern physicians have speculated that he may have had a genetic disorder called Marfan syndrome, or perhaps another one called MEN2B.
Which would affect connective tissue.
Right. It might explain his appearance and perhaps some of his lifelong health struggles, but it remains unproven without DNA evidence.
When you look back, Lincoln fundamentally redefined the presidency.
He did. He expanded the power of the office during a crisis in ways that set a precedent for every wartime president that followed.
And more than that, he redefined the philosophy of the country itself.
By anchoring the Constitution in the Declaration of Independence, he made the proposition of equality central to the American idea, even if the reality, as we know, has taken much, much longer to catch up.
It really is a staggering life to consider. From that dirt floor cabin in Kentucky to the preservation of the Union and the end of slavery. It makes you wonder. How would the Reconstruction era and the whole subsequent history of civil rights in America have looked if he had lived to oversee it instead of Andrew Johnson?
That is the great, tragic what-if of American history. Lincoln possessed a political skill, a magnanimity, and a moral flexibility that his successor completely lacked. It's almost certain the transition would have been less violent and the protections for the newly freed people more robust. We can only speculate.
A fascinating and sobering discussion.
Indeed.
Thanks for listening.